People often use the terms depression and sadness interchangeably. However, these two terms represent very different human experiences, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about the differences between depression and sadness. Hi everyone, I have a question for you. How would you know if you were feeling sad or if you had depression? We often think about sadness and depression as the same thing, but are they? The reality is there is so much more to depression than just a feeling of sadness and disappointment. And so what we're going to be talking about in today's video is some of the key differences between sadness and depression and how to tell them apart. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about the difference between sadness and depression. Now, if you're a sports fan, you've probably had an experience like this, where your favorite team fights through the playoffs to make it to the championship game, and you get really excited and hopeful for your team to win. But then, in the deciding game, they come up just short, and they lose. Think about how you would feel. There would be such a sense of disappointment or sadness and regret. And oftentimes, people will describe how they're feeling in that situation as, I'm so depressed because my team lost the big game. You see, the term depression has kind of become co-opted to now describe a sense of disappointment and sadness. But just because we use the term that way, that doesn't mean that's what the term depression actually means. Depression is a much deeper, insidious psychological condition and emotional state that's subjectively much different than sadness you might feel when your favorite sports team loses, for example. And you've probably had that sense that the term depression seems to carry more weight, a greater sense of darkness behind it than the term sadness. But you've probably never really thought about how depression and sadness actually differ from one another. Now, one of the first key differences to understand is that sadness is an emotion, whereas depression is a clinical condition associated with a specific set of symptoms and criteria. Sadness is a basic human emotion. Everyone knows what it feels like to be sad. We experience sadness from very early on in our lives. And the thing we often don't think about sadness is that, like every emotional state, sadness can serve a very useful and beneficial purpose. The emotion of sadness activates us to seek out support or care from other people when we experience a loss or a disappointment. And it's that seeking out that support that then can allow people to provide us with encouragement and comfort. So in that sense, sadness is actually a very healthy and helpful human emotion. Depression, on the other hand, is a psychological condition associated with a specific set of diagnostic criteria. It's much more than just the subjective state of feeling sad. The clinical condition of depression is associated with 9 core symptoms, of which a person needs to be experiencing at least 5 of those symptoms on a daily basis for at least 2 weeks. And so the 9 core symptoms of depression are feeling sad, depressed, or empty. It's what most people think of with depression. It also includes having lost interest or pleasure in almost all of your usual activities. Significant changes in appetite, either a loss of appetite or eating more. Sleep difficulties, either insomnia or sleeping too much. Feeling agitated, physically restless, or the opposite, moving slowly, talking slowly, almost like you're moving in water. Fatigue, loss of energy, being easily worn out. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive and inappropriate guilt. Cognitive difficulties, thinking difficulties, like difficulties with concentration, short-term memory, problems with indecisiveness, those types of things. And finally, thoughts of death or thoughts of suicide. So you see, there's so much more to depression than just feeling sad. It's so much deeper and bigger than that. Now, in fact, it's even possible to be depressed without feeling sad. So if you have 5 of those symptoms and sadness isn't one of them, you can still meet criteria for depression. Now, another big difference between sadness and depression is that sadness is a temporary change in mood, a specific reaction, whereas depression is an abnormal general state that a person experiences. So sadness is usually a response to something that happens. My girlfriend broke up with me. My favorite team lost the championship game. I got a bad performance review at work. Sadness in these types of situations is perfectly normal. There's nothing pathological or problematic or strange about that. But in depression, the sadness, that feeling of sadness or emptiness, applies to everything. We feel sad about everything, or we feel empty about everything. It doesn't require a difficult event, a difficult situation, or an experience of loss. We can feel depressed even in the absence of sadness triggers. Oftentimes, I'll have clients comment to me that everything in their life is going fine and they have no reason to feel depressed, but they still feel depressed. And so this then becomes something else that they then beat themselves up about. That they have nothing to feel depressed about, but they still feel depressed, and then they beat themselves up for feeling depressed, which just makes them feel worse. Now, for these people, life may be going objectively fine, but subjectively, the person can't shake the feeling of depression. You see, depression engulfs all activities and events in a person's life. Positive things happening, neutral things, setbacks, they're all met with the same general sense of emptiness, a lack of enthusiasm, and feeling of blah. It's like there becomes a disconnect between what's going on and the emotional state of the person. They feel depressed no matter what seems to be going on around them. Now, another key difference is that sadness tends to be a brief, time-limited emotional state, whereas depression can persist much longer. So sadness is an emotional state that it comes and goes. It's not persistent, and it doesn't often feel like a person is trapped in it. Sadness can last as little as a few hours, but usually decreases even just a little as we get distracted with other things going on. Even during periods of sadness, there are moments when a person feels okay. They're able to laugh at a funny movie or enjoy a fun activity with a friend. that feeling of sadness fades with time. Whereas depression is different. It lasts much longer and it's much more pervasive throughout a person's day. There's a lot less waxing and waning of the depression feelings, but more of a persistent feeling of depression and emptiness. The person isn't able to just snap out of the feeling of depression. Watching a funny movie or spending time with friends might have very little effect on the depression feelings in those moments. A person can go weeks and months feeling this way. Depression wears a person out. It makes it difficult to live life as usual. And finally, sadness as an emotional state is subjective. It's an internal state that you feel, and you determine if you're sad or not. There's no objective way of measuring sadness. It's how you feel. Now, depression, although it has a number of subjective components to it, also has some objective signs and symptoms that can be measured and assessed. So sure, the feelings of depression, sadness, emptiness, these are all internal and subjective. But there are a number of other aspects of depression that can be evaluated and assessed. Things like sleep difficulties or appetite problems, energy level, levels of fatigue, how much the person is engaging in activities that they enjoy doing, assessing a general sense of the person's activity level more generally, their ability to engage in social interactions and cognitive functioning, things like concentration and memory. These are all factors that can be observed, evaluated, and sometimes measured. So while sadness is kind of this ethereal emotional state that can only be felt by the person experiencing it, depression is something that can be much more apparent to other people if they know what to look for. So I hope that gives you a better sense of some of the differences between depression and sadness. And although they're often thought of as the same thing, they're actually quite different from one another. And I think part of this confusion between these two terms comes from the way we tend to be using clinical language like depression to describe normal human experiences like sadness. So by understanding some of the differences between sadness and depression, I hope it gives you a better sense of some of the differences between normal emotional states when we experience a loss or a disappointment, which is what happens when we feel sadness, versus pathological and impairing states like depression. So I'd love to hear your thoughts or ideas or questions about this, so please leave me some comments in the comment section down below. If you've been enjoying my videos and would like to see more, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and you'll be alerted every week when I post a new video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.